Hello, welcome to the True Mass Games YouTube channel. My name, of course, is Alex, and in this episode of Gamemaster's Musings, we are talking about maybe the most important topic, for me personally anyway, when it comes to role-playing games. And that topic is verisimilitude and the suspension of disbelief. How to make your game or in your game world real enough. We might have all had these discussions with people online when we're talking about logic in a plot of a book or a plot of a movie or a TV show, say Game of Thrones or something, and you say, no, this character, she's acting illogically. I don't believe that. That's weird. The author messed up. And the other person says, that's a fantasy thing. There's elves that can cast magic. Where's the logic there? And in this video, we'll mention why this is a very, very bad example of talking about logic and why this way of discussion is just ultimately flawed. When you start game mastering, when you start a campaign, a game, and your players come and they sit down, you all enter into a social contract. Your side of the contract is saying, I've prepared this world for you, and I'm making things possible for you so that we all, me, but also you guys, have fun. The player side of that special contract is they will pretend that what you're doing, the NPCs that you are playing, the world that you have created, is real. We're talking, of course, about the suspension of disbelief. Now, what is the suspension of disbelief? It is being willing to suspend one's critical faculties and believe the unbelievable, thus sacrificing logic and realism for the sake of entertainment and enjoyment. So, a very simple example is you're watching a magician perform, and he's pulling a bunny out of a hat or something like that. To really enjoy the act, you need to have a suspension of disbelief. Obviously, you don't believe that the magician actually has magic and he just created this bunny out of thin air with the force of his will or something like that. But if you're sitting there and going, no, stupid, it's obviously just a cheap trick, the bunny was like under the desk or something, you all won't be entertained because you don't have a suspension of disbelief. You're actively working against a potential suspension of disbelief that happens in your brain. And suspension of disbelief is something that happens to us all the time, really, in our modern society. Playing a computer game, watching a movie, reading a book, they're all ways where you have to engage your suspension of disbelief to have fun. Otherwise, your brain won't perceive these things as real, and the book will never really grip you, and the movie will never pull you in. In role-playing games, suspension of disbelief is even more important than in other mediums. There are two very, very important terms that we will use in this discussion. They are not the same things. One of the terms is realism, and the other one is verisimilitude. And they're often mixed up. Remember that example we talked about at the start of the video, how you can't use logic to explain a character or complain about the character's behavior if there's like wizard elves in the same setting? That argument comes from a misunderstanding of the difference between realism and verisimilitude. Realism means something is like the real world, like our world, right? And in our world there is no magic, so anything with magic does not have absolute realism. Verisimilitude means something is like a real world. So it is not like our world, but it is a believable, real seeming world, an illusion of a living, breathing world. And that is what I strive for to the extreme, probably maybe too extremely in some ways, in my games. And what you should strive for as well. Gaming is escapism to a large degree, right? We want to do things in our games that we can't do in the real world, or that might be way too dangerous for us to do in a real world. That's why we use games to pretend that we're doing things And if we have a strong suspension of disbelief, and if there's a lot of verisimilitude happening in the game world, it will feel nearly real to us enough that we could say that it is actually us who did that. Realism is, well, boring most of the time if it goes too far, because as I said, it goes against the notion of escapism in some ways. Don't just recreate our own world, but realism is an important tool that you can use to strengthen the illusion of your world, to strengthen the verisimilitude of your world. Just don't go too far. Why should we strive to create verisimilitude, to create a world that seems real, living, and breathing? There's a lot of reasons. I'll tell you a couple that I think are the most important ones. The first reason, the most important reason of them all, is having a real world, achieving verisimilitude, will hook in your players. They will be treating NPCs and their plans as if they were real, and they will become much more involved in your game. It is much easier to forge connections with NPCs and surroundings that seem real than it is to forge connections with NPCs that seem like a weird bunch of combinations that don't make any sense at all. And once your players become more connected to your world, and you become more connected to your world due to the verisimilitude, you will have much more enjoyment and much more fun, because everything will affect you much stronger. That everything that's happening within the game, that is. Having a world of verisimilitude allows your players to plan much better, because they know that the world is not just a bunch of random events, whatever shoots out of the Game Master's brain at that very moment. They know that there's some established inner world logic, and once they understand that, they know that their plans make sense, and it gives them tools to build plans. Tools that they would not have in a just amalgamation of random things happening all over the time and all over the place. Funnily enough, and I can't really prove this to you, but it is true, believe me, if you have a world of verisimilitude in your games, it will be much easier for you to come up with plots. To explain this, I'll say a few things that might sound a bit crazy to you, but they've happened to me a couple times in my career as a game master, and they're one of the coolest things for me as a game master that can happen to me. What I'm talking about is that the world starts living in your own brain. So if you have NPCs that you understand and that they're realistic, there are certain things that those NPCs would never do, and certain things that those NPCs are more likely to do. Once you understand that, which you can only do if you have realistic NPCs, or at least it's much easier to do if you have realistic NPCs, then a lot of options that you might have for plots and plans and such just disappear anyway. So it will make it much easier for you to first come up with plans, because it will be obvious to you what this NPC will be doing next, because that's the only logical consequence, the only logical choice for him. It's like he is living in your own brain as a living individual, and he's making the decisions, not you as the game master. And that's what sounds a bit weird. Voices in your head and all that sort of stuff. But I don't really mind that too much. I mean, to be a decent game master, you need to be at least a little bit of crazy, right? Well, anyway. And also, if you have the most of the world that is not weird and random, the things that are weird, that are magical, that are special, will feel more weird, more magical, more special. Contrast is everything, both in life and in games. So if you have an establishment, so to speak, an established logic and established realism in your world, the things that break that establishment will feel even more special, and there will be even more of a wow effect. And that only works if you have such an establishment. If you don't have any of that, then, well, nothing in your world will ever really feel that truly special, or at least it will be more difficult for anything to feel more truly special. Now, how much of verisimilitude you want in your own game and in your own campaign, that's something for you as the game master to decide. Maybe talk with your players about it. I personally, as I said before, I strive for it a lot, to an extreme that I am willing to sacrifice player fun and even my own fun, every now and then at least, to achieve a stronger result of verisimilitude. Sometimes I punish my player characters despite them having done nothing wrong, having made no mistakes, because that is what happens in the real world too. Not every bad thing that happens to people is deserved, right? And not every bad thing is avoidable. And that's the same thing in games. Sometimes bad things happen despite my player characters doing nothing wrong. And that can sometimes lead to a bit of frustration, but hopefully the overachieving effect of verisimilitude will have or add more fun to the game than it takes away with those extreme examples. How do you achieve verisimilitude? Well, there's a bunch of techniques. I'll be telling you a couple of them now, the most important ones anyway, that I'm using in my games quite a bit. There is a saying by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was a great poet and author. He said, "Infusing a human interest and the semblance of truth into a fantastic tale will make the reader suspend judging the improbability of the narrative." Well, of course he's talking about suspension of disbelief. And the two most important parts of what he says, the two core terms, so to speak, are on one hand, the human interest, and on the other hand, what he calls a semblance of truth. Now keep those two terms in mind as we're talking about techniques to make your world more real and achieve stronger verisimilitude. The first one, very easily understandable technique, is to create believable NPCs. I've actually done a whole video about this in one of my earlier GM Musings, so I'll put a link in the description underneath the video so you can take a look at that. I won't be using too much time to speak about that here, but that said, if you add this human interest, if you focus on, I suppose, personal stories, not so much massive global overachieving things that your players find hard to connect with, that will strengthen the immersion of everyone, both you and the player characters. Once they think that the NPCs are real and they act in a believable way, they will interact with them more and they will connect with them more strongly, which gives you the opportunity to use those NPCs to influence your players and their characters in some way, shape, or form, positive or negative. The semblance of truth, as Coleridge says, right? What that means is use parts of our own world, parallels to our own world, in your games. That makes the world seem real and believable because we all know our own world. So if there are things that are different from our own world, show that to your players. I mean, I suppose you could tell them by being an omnipresent narrator and just saying, okay guys, listen, this, and this is different. But show, don't tell is generally a very good storytelling technique. And even though it might be a bit more effort, take a bit more effort, it usually is worth it in the end. So use NPCs, use plots, use scenes in your game to show your player characters which parts of your game world differ from our own world. So maybe you have a feudal system taken straight from history in one of your realms, but in that feudal system there is a single very powerful wizard who controls a specific part of it. And that is obviously something that would be different to our own world. So the feudal system is something your players will understand much more easily than the role of that wizard. So focus and show them the role of that wizard. The third point is probably the most important one, the most important technique. Establish an inner world logic in your game. What does that mean? And how do you do that? Well, you need to be believable and you need to be consistent to establish such an inner world logic. And then inner world logic is just a fancy way of saying things generally need to make sense to your players. So even if they don't know why an NPC is doing something, they will either be able to figure it out, or they will trust you enough to believe that there is a reason, a logical reason that would make sense if they knew what it was, why the NPC is acting that way. And if they have realized why NPCs that they haven't understood at first, if they realized why they have been doing this in the past over the course of the game so far, they'll trust you much more with this, and you will be achieving more verisimilitude. There's two other things, two other reasons of logic that you need to add to your world to make it feel real and to establish an inner world logic. The first one is actions have consequences. Not just the actions of your player characters, although especially them, but also the actions of your NPCs. Whenever someone does something, the world changes to a smaller or larger degree. Make your players understand that and show them, again show, don't tell, those consequences. Every now and then, not constantly maybe, but every now and then, and fairly often in fact. In my opinion, the most important part of any GM's job is actually showing and establishing the consequences of player actions and NPC actions. The second part, the second logical conclusion that we have is that once you change the world, once you introduce an element that is different, it's not realistic, so say for instance magic in a feudal society like we mentioned before, everything changes with it. You can't just take away one part of the world and add another one part and then say, okay, I'll leave everything else the same. No, that's not how the world works. A real world, a verisimilitude world, needs to be connected. Like a spider web. If you cut one part of the web, the whole spider web will shift. And that is how it works. So you can't just say, okay, I have this, I don't know, medieval European society, I add magic, but it's still a very normal European society, medieval one of course, and nothing else changes. That's not realistic, it's not part of verisimilitude, and that's actually one of my main problems that I have with a lot of role-playing games out there. They do not show you what happens if you add supernatural elements into a realistic world. Because every supernatural element has to have consequences and change the world around them. Especially if you have a lot of magic, how does society change? If you have a lot of magic, why is there still farmers if a single wizard could do the work of 1 million farmers? Why is not every single ruler a powerful wizard? Who's to stop the wizards from taking over? How do generally people react when they come into contact with magic? What's the tension between mages and non-mages, like the X-Men movies or comics, right? Mutants and non-mutants. The world changes, the world reacts if you add supernatural elements. Show that, again, to your players. Now we're coming to a few points where not everyone will probably agree with me. Well, and even some people that are very famous and extremely good game masters, let's throw the name Matthew Mercer in there, might not agree with me on all these points, but nonetheless they are points that lead to more verisimilitude. One of these points is, don't focus on your player characters too much. The player characters are not the center of the world. A realistic world, a world of verisimilitude, does not have a center. Like in our world, every person is the center of their own universe. Every NPC sees the world from its own perspective. And the world does not have a center. If your player characters want all the attention, if they want to be present everywhere, if they want to be able to influence the world more than anyone else does, well, then they'll need to grab the world by the throat and force it to become that way. If they earn that, great. That's amazing. That's an amazing feeling. And because your player characters are aware that your world is a world of verisimilitude, they will know that such an undertaking is not easy, but should they achieve it, they will feel amazing. I can guarantee you that. The world is big. A lot of things are happening, no matter if your player characters are close by or not. They don't need to be present at all the important things. Not every single monster attack, not every single world-changing plotline will happen close to the player characters. The world is progressing by itself. No matter what they do, they can influence that in a way, or they don't. That's up to them. And also up to see how successful they are if they try that. The easiest way to show that to your player characters is to have NPC plans that are unconnected to your player characters, and to use rumors and events that are also unconnected, or at least initially unconnected, to your players and their characters. For instance, your player characters are traveling and they come into a village, and in that village there is some sort of local festival going on, or say there's a wedding being planned. That wedding has nothing to do with the player characters. They don't know the bride, they don't know the groom. They might get to know them if they want to become involved into the wedding. Maybe they'll drink a few beers at the wedding celebration because everyone sort of in the village is invited, no matter if they're strangers or villagers. But if they ignore it, that's fine. The bride and the groom, they're their own NPCs. They are not connected to the player characters, and they'll just continue living on their lives. Other NPCs might have childbirths. Maybe an NPC that the player characters haven't seen in a while has 2 children all of a sudden. That's what I mean. The world progresses, it moves on, no matter what the player characters are close by or not. Of course, keeping track of all that is a lot of work for a game master, but if you want to achieve verisimilitude, there's no shortcut. You just need to put in the work. Encounters in such a realistic world do not always need to be solvable. In the real world, if you pick a fight with someone, there's no guarantee that there's a chance for you to win the fight. The same in a realistic verisimilitude game world. Another technique that you can use are coincidences. In the real world, coincidences are a thing. In game worlds, in books and movies and such, coincidences often are not really a thing. What happened to me, for instance, is when I was in Sydney. I mean, I'm living in Europe, so I was in Sydney for a couple days, about 5 or 6 days once, and I actually ran into a guy who only lives maybe about 3-4 blocks away from my house, an acquaintance of mine. And we were both like, wow, what's a weird coincidence? And of course, because this being the real world, we just said, oh, okay, interesting coincidence. Spent a couple hours together and then went our separate ways, and that was it. If that was a book or a game, you would be thinking, oh shit, what is this guy doing here? There's no way this is a coincidence. This has something to do with the plot. Maybe he's here to murder me. Maybe he's stalking me. Maybe there's something gonna happen to him and I need to save him, right? That's what people would automatically be thinking in a sort of metagame thinking way. But throw a couple coincidences in there every now and then. Not everything has to be connected to the player characters and the plot. Remember when I compared suspension of disbelief and games to like a magician show? Well, if you run a game like this, you as the game master are the magician. Don't reveal your tricks. A magician doesn't. You shouldn't either. What does that mean? Well, don't break your role as the game master. Don't break the fourth wall all the time. Once you sit down, you're no longer, well, for instance, I'm no longer Alex, your friend. I am the game master. I am the world. That's who I am, and that is what makes the world real, or at least achieves verisimilitude, right? Don't explain yourself. Don't choose sides. Don't side. Some people say, weirdly enough, I think Matt Colwell mentioned it in one of his videos. He said, during an encounter, he sides with the players by saying, oh, if you do this, then the monsters will probably do that. So how about you try this and that and that? Basically revealing things that the characters wouldn't know to the players to make the game tactical. He said that strengthens verisimilitude. To me, that completely breaks it. You're now a game master. You're no longer the monster, or you're no longer the force behind the enemy, so to speak, their hive mind in a way. You're just a guy sitting at the table rolling a couple of dice. And that obviously weakens suspension of disbelief and verisimilitude, or at least to me. Another way to reveal your tricks is to have your players be part of world building. A lot of game masters do that. Like say, okay, your player character, he's from this province up north. I have no idea, as the game master, what's up in that province. You come up with a bunch of stuff. I never do that. I would never do that. In a small way, sure, if your player character wants to play a noble from a specific house, I'll tell him, okay, why don't you come up with some vague ideas about that house? and then I will attach all the other things that his player character doesn't know to that house. But going further than that is, in my opinion, extremely immersion breaking and will destroy verisimilitude and the suspension of disbelief, because the players will always have in their brain, oh, this is the guy I created, this is the house I created, I know about these people, this is this and this and this, that's all the stuff I know. And it's very hard for a player to shift out of that mindset. Finally, the sixth point is, don't do Gamemaster metagaming. I've done a video about this last week. I'll put the link in the description underneath the video. But that is another effective way to destroy verisimilitude and destroy the suspension of disbelief that your players might be prepared to bring to the table, hopefully. Another little trick that I would like to mention at the end of the video that a lot of you are probably already doing, but it's always worth mentioning because it strengthens verisimilitude, is have a list of names prepared. Just names. Male, female, gnome, halfling, half-orc, whatever. The most common people in your games. And then once your player characters walk up to an NPC, a shopkeeper for instance, asks, what's your name? And you're like, oh shit, no idea, he's just a shopkeep. That of course breaks verisimilitude because you're now talking as the game master and not talking as that shopkeeper or even the narrator. So now you can just look up, cast a quick glance to your left, and you have the name, I don't know, Boris the shopkeeper. And now you talk, you say the shopkeeper's name, he says, oh, my name's Boris. What's your name? How'd you do? What can I do for you, friends? And that way you keep verisimilitude, and then while the player's characters are talking, you just write down next to the name Boris, shopkeeper in, I don't know, Greenhome, whatever the name of your village is, the village that your player characters are currently traveling through. Very simple technique to achieve and strengthen verisimilitude. Now let me know in the comments below the video, and I'm kind of already afraid of these comments a bit, to be perfectly honest, how important is verisimilitude to you, and to what lengths would you go to preserve it? What have you done to uphold it? Has it worked? Has it not worked? Whether you were a game master or a player, what happened when verisimilitude broke down? What's some of your worst stories? What's some of your best stories? Or maybe the whole thing isn't important to you at all, but then I don't know why you've been watching the whole video until now. Anyway, if you enjoyed our content, feel free to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel right up here. We'll be putting up more GM musings and streaming more different games and such, all through the year hopefully. And as always, if you have questions, let me know. And until we see each other again, good luck with your own games, and True Mouse Games says bye-bye and good night.